Test 1, 2. Okay, that worked. Let's try going back to the Okay, I think we're good now. My apologies, everybody. Let me know if that's working. Do we have sound? Okay, now. All right, so this is my Yeti microphone, and I reposition it when I get started each night. And unfortunately, there's this little button right here that is a mute button, and it's right where my thumb goes when I pick it up. So I hit the mute button. I'm sorry. Okay. Thank you for letting me know. That would have been very frustrating getting all the way through. Charles says he can hear. Mike can hear now. Rob can hear now. All right, we're good. My apologies. All right, so as I was saying, I was just saying that I have a hard time getting back into a routine after being on vacation, and also that I was really scrambling tonight to get everything set up in time, which is how it works. So if you're not yet on the email distribution list, please shoot me an email. Hello, Roseanne. Send me an email, and I will put you on the distribution list. Then you'll have the story to read in advance each week, and it'll be the reminder that, yes, we are having class tonight. I was saying that I think that we're going to have class every week going forward until the holidays. I don't think there's anything coming up between now and then. And if you miss an episode, it's easier to find on YouTube. If you have subscribed, it will come up in your feed. And if you like the video, it'll make it easier for other people to find. And if you're watching on Facebook, you want to subscribe to either my channel or the church's channel, or both, or follow rather. You want to follow either of those channels, and that will help you see that as well. And of course, like the videos too, because the more the videos get liked, the more other people are likely to see them in their feed, and that's a way for us to do evangelism very easily. Hi from Southern Maryland. Vargas and Gene are back from vacation and watching. Welcome back to where you are. I was in New York most of last week and thoroughly enjoyed all of it, except for the unintentional jog we had to make across Brooklyn when we had to change trains because there was a fire on the tracks. But enough about me. You didn't hear my prayer, so let us pray again, shall we? Gracious God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, for you alone are our rock and our redeemer. Amen. And now my light's on the flip. Come on. What? One technical difficulty after another. And when I first started doing these live streams, they said in the articles about it, remember, you need duplicates of everything. If you think you've got one light, you might have no light. If you think you have one mic, you might not have any. If you think you've got two, you know you got one. So always have doubles. I don't have doubles of anything. All right, let's go ahead and get started. 1 Kings, taken from chapters 11 and 12. Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, rebelled against the king. This is the story of why he rebelled. Solomon used workers conscripted from all over the kingdom for his building projects. After they finished the temple and the palace, they went to work building up the walls and the moat around the fortified part of Jerusalem. Jeroboam was one of the workers. Solomon saw how industrious he was, and he put him in charge of the laborers. One day, as he was leaving, Jeroboam was confronted by the prophet Ahijah. Ahijah was wearing a new robe, which he took off and ripped into 12 pieces. He gave 10 of them to Jeroboam and said, "The Lord has said that he will take 10 tribes away from Solomon and give them to you. The Lord is doing this because Solomon has worshipped Ashtoreth, Chemosh, and Milcom. He hasn't followed the Lord, as his father did. But for David's sake, the Lord will let Solomon's son keep Judah. If you follow the Lord, he will build a house for you like he did for David." When Solomon heard about this, he tried to have Jeroboam killed. but he escaped to Egypt. Solomon reigned over Israel for 40 years. Then he slept with his ancestors, and his son Rehoboam took the throne. I'm going to pause here. So we've got two guys whose names sound familiar, whose names sound similar, Jeroboam and Rehoboam. Okay, Jeroboam is the guy who was in charge of the workers from the north. Rehoboam is Solomon's son. I'll try to keep it straight. You try to keep it straight too. All right. So Solomon died. Rehoboam took the throne. Rehoboam went to Shechem, where Israel gathered for the coronation. Jeroboam came back from Egypt and met with him at Shechem. He represented the northern tribes and said, "Your father made the people work too hard. If you will lighten our load, we will serve you." Rehoboam said, "Give me 3 days to think about it." Rehoboam met with his father's advisors, who were elderly, and they advised him, "You should grant this request. If you serve them, they will serve you." But Rehoboam didn't take their advice. Instead, he took the advice of the young men he'd grown up with. When he met with Jeroboam and the others 3 days later, he said, "My finger is thicker than my father's waist. You will work harder for me than you did for him. He beat you with whips, but I will beat you with barbed whips." When the people heard this, they said, "We have no share in David's kingdom." And the northern tribes all went home. When Rehoboam sent Adoram to get the next shift of northern laborers, they stoned him to death and made Jeroboam king of the northern tribes. They've been in rebellion ever since. Rehoboam gathered his army to attack the north, but the Lord spoke to Shemaiah the prophet and said, "Tell the king not to go to war with your own relatives." The king heeded the message and sent everyone home. So this is the story of how Israel's unified empire, unified kingdom came to an end. So throughout the rest of the Old Testament, when we see the word Judah, it's referring to the tribe of Judah, which is now all of the nation that is ruled over by the king in Jerusalem. The 10 northern tribes have all seceded and will be referred to as Israel for the rest of the Old Testament, and that which is confusing because what we think of Israel today is Judah, and what we think and what the Bible calls, the Old Testament calls Israel, that's actually Syria and Lebanon today. So just keep that in your heads, and those names are hard to keep straight. So the interesting thing about this is just recently, within the last month or so, it was in July sometime, I read an article about an archaeological discovery that had finally been properly examined. They stumbled onto it a while ago, but the way these things work is very often when they're digging for often for something that has something to do with research, they'll be digging a foundation for a building and they'll hit something and they'll realize, oh, this is really old, we can't dig here. But they don't have the time or the budget to study it, so they just leave it buried or rebury it, actually, and they don't get around to it sometimes for decades. And they finally got to properly examine this thing, and they've determined that it was a moat that was actually carved out of the bedrock of Mount Zion that surrounded part of the ancient city of Israel. And this was interesting because the Bible uses Hebrew words to describe certain structures in Jerusalem, and we've never been 100% sure of what they were talking about because they use these proper names for them instead of descriptive words like wall or moat or terrace or things like that. And what they've discovered is that there was a moat. It's interesting because this means the city was cut in two. So there was a lower level, which was the residential section. Then there was the upper level, which is where the palace and the temple were. It's all changed today. This has all since been buried. But there were originally two levels, and the top part was the heavily fortified part, and there was a moat that went around it, separating the rest of the city, which is lower, which I believe was also fortified, but not nearly as much. So they basically cut this big moat through the middle of the city, which was problematic because before you could cross anywhere, now you can only cross where they had the bridge, which could be, sealed off so people couldn't attack through there. Oh, Cindy's late, but glad to be here. Glad to have all of y'all with us. So this moat probably is part of what Solomon's people built, because David and Solomon dramatically rebuilt the city of Jerusalem once they took over. So that's just a bit of interesting archaeological history there. So what does this story tell us about God? Well, God is present in this story. A lot of the stories we have to say, well, God didn't really say or do anything in this story, but we know that God was watching. So what's God thinking? Today, God speaks through two different prophets. And so God had already warned Solomon. God warns and warns and warns. This is what's going to happen if you don't. And then finally, God acts. So God warned them that if they were not faithful, it would have repercussions for the future of the dynasty. Solomon was unfaithful anyway, and then there were consequences for the future of the dynasty. So the entire nation has not been taken away, but most of it has been taken away. He's got Judah, and the Levites don't have land, so the Levites are there. Well, the Levites kind of lived all over, but they were more heavily concentrated around Jerusalem because of their connection with the temple. So God warns us before he acts, usually more than once. He doesn't always warn us. Sometimes people need to be stopped in their tracks, but usually God warns us more than once. And what does this tell us about ourselves? I want to do that one second, last actually. What does this tell us about our relationship with God and each other? Well, when God warns people, he usually does it through other people. So, the prophets, they get dreams where God speaks to them directly. Most people don't have that experience. They don't have God speaking to them in words in a dream. I do know people who felt that God has spoken to them. I'm one of them. In words, in a dream, no, I haven't had visions of that nature. But mostly God speaks to me through other people, and I realize, this person is delivering a message from God. That's how God does it. So that's an important thing about our relationship with God and each other. Now, what does this story tell us about ourselves? And this is, as I get older, I get different perspectives on these things because, all right, so Solomon, the Bible, the Old Testament in particular, heavily prizes the wisdom that comes with age, right? And it should. Or should it? I'm not really second guessing God or the scriptures here. I guess I'm playing devil's advocate. Ernest Hemingway was once asked what wisdom he had gained with age, and his answer was so cynical. He said that you don't gain wisdom with age, you gain caution with age. He says wisdom is different. Wisdom isn't caution. Wisdom is something you're either born with or you'll never have. I don't think he's right about that. I think age provides the opportunity to acquire wisdom, and many of us do, provided that we actually learn from our mistakes. But not everybody does learn from their mistakes. Some people just keep on making the same old mistakes throughout their entire lives, and they don't actually gain any wisdom with age. But Solomon was wise, and apparently he surrounded himself with wise people who were elderly by the time his son came to the throne, and he did not take the wisdom of age. He didn't follow the advice. He followed the intemperate advice, the bombastic advice of his friends, who I'm sure were real excited that their buddy is now the king, right? I'm picturing him and his drinking buddies from high school. It would have been hanging out in the palace like the Memphis Mafia that Elvis had. And they're going, you need to tell those laborers, you need to go back and you need to tell those laborers that your little finger is thicker than your dad's waist. And by the way, there's a debate over whether when he said little finger, he actually meant the pinky finger or if that was a euphemism for another part of the body. I got to be careful how I do that now. Apparently, some of these video platforms now have AIs that watch for obscenities like middle fingers, and they sometimes make mistakes and will ban you if you do something that they mistake as profanity. So I probably shouldn't have done that. I'm always afraid of the bots. Anyway, so that's what he does. He takes the advice of his loud, crazy young friends. I'm taking some artistic license there. And he goes back and he foolishly handles the northern tribes, who then secede from the nation. And I say that I view this a little differently because, you know, it's not always the case that your tenured advisors have the better advice. Sometimes the younger advisors have the better advice, and that's because sometimes, okay, now this was probably much less true in the ancient world, because in the ancient world, times changed very slowly, and sometimes they didn't change noticeably from one generation to the next. So when your dad said, "Oh, I was in the exact same situation when I was your age," very likely he was in the exact same situation. But now, if I were to say to my kids, "Oh, I was in the same situation when I was your age," I wouldn't be honest in doing that, because I know their life is very different from mine. So sometimes, but not every dad um, realizes that, and sometimes they insist. No, the advice that I would have given 20 years ago is exactly the same as the advice I would have given now. Not really paying attention to the you hear what I'm saying. So in church life, of course, you know, you've always you've always got younger folk who want to try something new. Now, older folks saying that ain't gonna work. Now, does that sound ageist? It probably is. Sometimes you get older folk who want to try new things, and sometimes you get younger folk who don't. It's not an age thing, actually. It's a generational thing. Studies show that people do not become more or less averse to change as they age. People who liked change when they're young still like it when they're old. People who hate change when they're young still hate it when they're old. People are remarkably consistent on that. I do think people sometimes gain wisdom, but sometimes I think they gain too much caution. I look at some of my younger colleagues, and they're a lot more innovative than I am, and I watch what they're doing, and I try to take it, and I try to think, okay, now this is something interesting that they're trying here. I want to see if this works, because if it does work, I'm going to try it. I'm not an early adapter on the curve distribution over liking change versus not liking change. I'm on the liking change side, but not on the extreme side. I'm on the later adopters of change side. So I do like change, but I don't want to be the first one to try it. I want to see somebody else be the first one to try it, so I don't get too much mud on my face when I do it. So I'm watching my younger colleagues with their innovative ideas, and I'm thinking, I'm going to see if this works. I'm going to try it. Other times I'm watching going, ooh, I think if they had some of my experiences, they wouldn't have been so eager to try that one. And ooh, yeah, it did blow up in their faces. But then sometimes they surprise me. So what's my point in all of this? Well, you got to find that sweet spot, because some of us do get, I will say, overly cautious with age. Because I think it's not always just about liking change versus not liking change. It's about, sometimes you've been burned by the stove so many times you don't want to touch it again. I mean, at least I see that in myself. I think that's probably true of other people. Hello, Sandy. I don't know if I said hi to you yet. So you do want to have some younger advisors around. You want to listen to them. You want to listen to your older advisors too. The situation we're in now is not exactly the same as Solomon and Rehoboam. Things have changed since the early days. When I look at my week now in ministry, I mean, if you had told me that I would be doing this every week 30 years ago, I'd have laughed at you. I said, even if I had the technology to do it, and I wouldn't have thought it would have existed. Even if I had the technology to do it, I wouldn't want to do it, I would have told you. Well, that's a pretty important part of my ministry. So things change, and we're not always fast enough to change with them. And then, of course, there's others who want to change too quickly. G.K. Chesterton said that the job of liberals is to come up, I'm paraphrasing, I'm getting as close as I can though. The job of liberals is to come up with new bad ideas. And the job of conservatives is to make sure that the old bad ideas never get abandoned. Well, that's a man who gained caution with age, right? All right. So that's why. So you've got youthful and again innovation, but you've also got youthful arrogance. You've got aged wisdom, but you've also got aged stubbornness and caution. We need to walk that fine line and ask not just, all right, this person's older, so they must have a wiser idea, or this person is younger, so they must have a more innovative idea. Who is speaking on behalf of God today? Whose voice sounds like something that God would say? There. So that's our scripture lesson for the night. I'm going to go into a little bit of news. I talked about this in church 2 Sundays ago before I went on vacation. I downloaded the book Hillbilly Elegy because it had come back into the news again. I had not read it. I had not seen the movie, although I'm going to watch the movie. I understand it's on Netflix right now. I did not read it until I got back from vacation yesterday morning. I started looking at it when I had a few minutes sitting around here and there. And it is a fascinating book. It's an absolutely fascinating book. Of course, I'm reading it because J.D. Vance wrote it, and he's Trump's vice presidential pick, and everybody's talking about it. I want to give my own personal opinion on it. I have a personal opinion on who J.D. Vance is now. But the J.D. Vance who wrote Hillbilly Elegy is not the same person that is appearing on TV right now. I don't know whether he's changed or whether he's reading a script or whatever. He's a young guy. Young people change. I've changed a lot since I was 30. Good grief. Some of you have known me that long, and you know how much I've changed since I was 30. But at any rate, so I'm reading the book, and it is a fascinating read. I've not wanted to put it down, actually. That surprises me. Did not expect to be as into it as I am. Before I say anything else about it, I want to say 2 things. First is that I love Appalachia. And second is that I don't want anything that I say about this book to be construed as being a comment on the current presidential campaign, because it's background information and nothing more. So I pointed out in church on 2 Sundays ago, some people loved the book, some people hated it. It was a bestseller, so a lot of people loved it. Its reviews are very high. The movie itself, the movie based on it, got terrible reviews from critics, but very high audience scores. That always says something to me. Whenever there's a huge disparity between critics and audiences, I have yet to agree with a critic when there was a big disparity. There have been movies that I liked that nobody else liked, but whenever the audience loves a movie and the critics hate it, I can't think of a single time I haven't loved it. So once again, haven't seen the movie yet. But I read a criticism online by somebody I know who said that it painted Appalachia in a bad light, that it generalized the Appalachian people based on his experiences with his own family. And he does do that. He says, this is my family's story. And I think that my family's story is representative of a bigger cultural problem. And here are the studies that I've found that would back that claim up. Okay. Now, he said this isn't scientific and you shouldn't take too much out of it, but he thinks he's onto a truth here that needs to be heard. And so far I'm with him. It's not a perfect work. Nothing is, but what I said in church on Sunday is that I've lived in every part of the state now except for Eastern Shore and over on the peninsula near Delaware. I've lived in Baltimore City. I've lived in Baltimore County. I've lived in Harford County. I've lived in Montgomery County. I've lived in Prince George's County. I've lived in St. Mary's County. I've lived in Frederick County. I've lived in Washington County. That's a big swath of this. I haven't lived in the extreme Western Panhandle, but I've been out there quite a bit, and I've spent more than a few summers in Appalachia. Well, I'm in Appalachia right now. I'm in Greater Appalachia. I've spent more than a little bit of time in Central Appalachia. It's an area that I love, truly love. Um, I've Each of the places I've lived had a different type of culture. Whenever I'm doing DEI training or something, they always want to know, how do you feel about your culture of origin? And I never really know how to answer that because I don't know what my culture of origin is. Is it where I lived when I was a child? Is it where I've lived one of the various, because each one was different. Living in PG County, that was a different culture from St. Mary's County. And Baltimore County and Baltimore City, two very different cultures. The people might look similar, but they don't act similar. So I'm not real clear on what my culture of origin is. It's not, there is no one single, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant culture. That's part of what he is saying in the book, is that the culture of Scotch-Irish Appalachia is not the same as the culture of northeastern white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. There are peculiarities to it. And what I said in church on Sunday 2 weeks ago, without having started the book yet, was that every culture, no culture is immune to criticism. Every culture has weaknesses that cause it problems. Sometimes, and I would go so far as to say every culture has an Achilles heel, which is that one flaw that in a perfect storm can bring the whole thing crashing down. Every culture has one of those. Every subculture has one of those. And as a general rule, that Achilles heel is painfully obvious to everybody outside of that subculture. And some of us can probably say, well, I grew up in a certain area, and I didn't realize until I moved somewhere else that there were some peculiarities about that place where I grew up. And looking back on it, that wasn't a good thing. That caused us problems. It's from the outside that you normally get this perspective. Okay, so every culture has an Achilles heel, and every culture is kind of blind to their own biggest flaw, but outsiders see it. When outsiders try to point out that flaw, insiders, they're not open to it. And that's basic human nature. You say, you don't know me. You think you think you understand me. You think you understand my culture. You think you understand why we do the things we do, but you don't. You see this thing as being a weakness, whereas we see it as a value. You just don't understand. That's how we react when our values are challenged. But our values need to be challenged. And sometimes we're not going to have the objectivity to challenge them. So it would not surprise me that people who considered J.D. Vance to be an outsider to Appalachia might not like what he had to say about it. The interesting thing is he doesn't consider himself to be an outsider. He considers himself to be an insider. And in fact, he says that one of the values that Appalachians have is that they don't share their business with outsiders. And the fact that he has written a book about his experience growing up that sort of turns a magnifying glass on some of the values, he says that's betrayal in that culture, that he has betrayed them. And and many of them are going to react that way. He was self-conscious of that when he did it. And he talks about how within families, the nuclear family, well, the extended family is hugely important, but outsider is a broad category. So, once somebody moves out of the house, once somebody grows up and moves out, he was saying that you don't share with that person on the same level that they did when they were living in the house. If there's drama going on in the house, people who used to live here but moved out, they don't necessarily need to know about that. So he talks about that. He also talks about how one of the values, and I have encountered this in other subcultures. Several of the places where I have served, there has very much been a mentality that we don't invite third parties into our disputes. We settle this between ourselves, and that's true for children and for adults. So whereas I was raised, when you go to school, if there's a kid messing with you, you go to your teacher and you tell the teacher, this kid's messing with me. Please talk to them because I don't want to deal with this. Well, I knew other kids who really looked down on that approach because their parents told them, if a kid's messing with you, let them have it. You know, some of them would have been a little bit more nuanced to that, but most of them were not. They're like, this is between the two of you. There's no reason to bring a teacher into this. The two of you need to sort this out. That's how people grow and how people learn. And that mentality can go forth into adult life as well. And he was saying in the book that that's what mountain justice is all about. And I'm familiar with the concept of mountain justice from my trips to Appalachia. That's when you have a beef with your neighbor or the guy across the street or a relative or whatever. You settle it man to man. You do not get the law involved. You don't call the police. You don't call a lawyer. You don't lawyer up. You don't take them to court. If they took your tractor, you go get it back. Or if they did something to you, you settle the score. And the community is sort of paying attention, and that's how it all works out. That means that you have a lot of violent confrontations. So he would consider that to be a flaw in that culture. Now, the question is it wrong of him to speak that he's making a generalization there. Is it fair for him to make that generalization? And that's where we're going to have disagreements. I mean, I'm saying right now, I heard the concept of mountain justice long before I started reading this book. I've heard it talked about many, many times. And like I said, I experienced it myself. And another thing that I experienced in Southern Maryland was this notion that if your kid has a problem with another kid, let's say they get into a fight and the school calls, it doesn't matter if your kid was right or wrong. It doesn't matter how badly the other kid was injured by your kid. You take your kid's side. This is not an opportunity for the kid to learn from their mistakes. This is an opportunity for them to learn that you are in their corner. Because if you're not in their corner, nobody else ever will be either. They need to know that family sticks together. Okay, so if you know full well that your kid is actually the bully who beat up on some other kid, you still defend your kid and say the other kid had it coming. And I've had it explained to me exactly like that. That's the right way to handle these things. So I've experienced some of what he is talking about in other cultures, not just in Appalachia. So one of the themes of his book so far, and I'm not that far into it, several chapters in, and this is something else that I said on Sunday, is that so all communities have flaws, but the wealthier a community is, the more resources they have to deal with those problems. So if a community has a big problem with addiction of some sort, whether it's alcohol or meth or fentanyl or whatever, rich communities might be able to weather that storm because they can afford to send their kids to the best rehab centers. They can give the kids job opportunities despite the fact that they've had these problems. They're going to be able to deal with that better than a community that has very few resources, has no rehab centers, and if they did, you wouldn't be able to afford it anyway because they're not free. So it's the old men. It's as the saying goes. When a rich man gets a cold, a poor man gets the flu, right? Because the vulnerabilities are there. Hello, Stella. Good to have you with us. So that means that if an area has fewer economic opportunities, the decisions you make in that community are all the more important. They have to be made wisely. All right. So the less opportunity community has, the more important it is to make wise decisions. And saying that is not, in my book, blaming the poor for their own problems. It's just saying the truth out loud. The other things he talks about are how crucial family stability is to upward mobility and by upward mobility, he means economic mobility. Um, I think there's a lot of good data behind that. Um, and the effect that despair has on people, and the psychological element of poverty, and how it affects different populations differently depending on the history of that population. And once again, I'm not very far into the book, but one of the things he points out, he says that working class white men in this country right now are the most pessimistic people in the country. Working class white men are the most pessimistic people in the country. Multiple studies have shown that. That is why the overdose rate and the suicide rate has skyrocketed in that population, which is interesting because they're not the economically worse off group, and they're not the least upwardly mobile group. Well, actually, I take that back. They might be the least upwardly mobile group. We don't have good data on that I know of. But so by comparison, Hispanic male immigrants are far poorer than the white men of Appalachia, but they're also far more optimistic. So what is going on there? And how is that going to affect the prospects of that? He's going to say that he's going to bet that the immigrants are going to fare much better economically going forward because of that optimism than the people who are experiencing the extreme despair. That's hard to argue with. There's no question that despair just hamstrings everything you do, and despair is crippling. And some of our communities are in absolute abject despair right now. And Appalachian communities, not just Central Appalachia, but Greater Appalachia, where we are right now, there are communities that are in absolute abject despair. And saying, well, it's all in your heads. Those of us who have felt despair at different points in our lives know that that is not a particularly helpful course of action. All right, so that's all I have to say. Now, I've got a lot to say. I've been gone for too long. Last thing I want to talk about is right before I left, we had some shootings here downtown. And right after I got back, there was another. One of those incidents was criminals shooting at criminals. The other incident, as I understand it, and I could be wrong, this was my understanding of what happened, was that you had an altercation escalate when, instead of calling the police, people called family members and asked them to come over and intervene. And as a result, now somebody's in the hospital. Very sad. There's been a lot of drama on social media about these events. And I was at a meeting with pastors and the mayor this morning, and it was great to be surrounded by people who are gracious and full of love and wanting to see the silver lining and to chart a hopeful path forward, because I can get in a pretty agitated mood over some of the hate-filled rhetoric I see sometimes online. Part of me wants to say that the level of conversation that is happening online about these shootings is a little surprising, considering the fact that we don't have a lot of shootings in Hagerstown, but these aren't the first since I've been here. We had shootings last year too, and we didn't get this kind of drama on social media about it. And I'm going to say it's because last year wasn't an election year, and this year is. So now people got a lot to say about shootings. So things I want to say about that is, first of all, Hagerstown's a great town. I love it here. I walk around downtown all the time, and all these people saying that downtown isn't safe and people shouldn't go down there and blah, blah, blah. They're just full of it, okay? In many ways, Hagerstown is like every other city in America. If you want to find trouble, if you go downtown looking for trouble, you will find it. If you go downtown to mind your own business, your business is going to go just fine. And I've seen very few instances where things played out differently from that. This town has problems that are very much like every other problems, but there's a lot to celebrate here in Hagerstown. Despite what people might want to say, violent crime is down, not up. Things are getting better on the law enforcement scene. Investment downtown isn't just up, it is dramatically up. There has not been this level of investment in the city in 60 years. Things are going very well on that front. Yeah, we have a problem with homelessness. The whole country has a problem with homelessness. We have a problem with poverty. We have a problem with drugs. And all of those are interrelated, and they're all part of the despair that we talked about, because we have built an economy in which the average worker cannot afford the average home. And by average home, I don't just mean that they can afford to buy the average single family home. I mean, the average worker cannot afford to rent the average apartment in Hagerstown. That is a huge problem. So, but a lot of people are doing a lot of really good work on these problems. And the people who say nobody's doing anything about this are just plain wrong. Now, if you mean to say that the government's not doing anything about this, well, you've got a little bit of an argument there. I mean, yeah, there is public housing. We've got multiple public housing towers downtown. Some are owned by the city, some are owned by the county. Some of them are privately owned, but they were built with government money and are government regulated. They're quasi-governmental things. So the government has a hand in the homeless situation, and the government hands out money, but the government doesn't. The government can't solve any of those problems. They have their contributions that they can make, but it's ultimately churches, faith-based nonprofits, and other non-governmental organizations that have the ability to get involved in people's lives at the level that they need to actually make a difference. You do not want the government involved in people's lives at the level that it would need to be to solve the drug problem or the homeless problem or the crime problem. Are there ways the government could do that? Yeah, if you want to live in Soviet Russia, I'm sure the government could solve all of these problems, but that's not the kind of country that I want to live in. We want the private sector to handle these problems, and that's where the nonprofits come in. And the nonprofits of Hagerstown, and there are many, do excellent work. And thankfully, we have a mayor who I would call a friend of mine, who has not been treated particularly well by some people lately. I won't go into that, but she understands who it is that actually gets the work done down here, and she wants the government to put its weight behind those organizations. And I appreciate that, and I'm very thankful for her. And if you're watching, Mayor, thank you and God bless you. That's all I have to say about that. All right. Kept you long tonight, but man, y'all stayed with me. So thank you for sticking with me. I got a little bit long-winded. I don't know what Bible story we're going to be talking about next week. We might do a time skip. Thinking it might be a good time to do a time skip, because we're into the annals of the kings of Israel now, and the annals of the kings of Judah, and most of the kings weren't particularly interesting. So we might do a time skip here, or get some prophets in. I don't know, but thank you all for joining. We'll see you all next week. If I don't see you online, I'll see you in church, or the other way around. In the meantime, let us pray. Gracious God, give me the grace to accept with serenity the things that cannot be changed, the courage to change the things which should be changed, and the wisdom to distinguish the one from the other, living one day at a time, enjoying one moment at a time, accepting hardship as a pathway to peace, taking, as Jesus did, this sinful world as it is, not as I would have it, trusting that you will make all things right if I surrender to your will, so that I may be reasonably happy in this life and supremely happy with you forever in the next. Amen. All right, folks. Thanks again. God bless.